Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli with the first lecture for week 7 on the respiratory system again. And this lecture is about gas exchange in the lungs and in the systemic tissues. And the picture that you're looking at on this screen is a color enhanced scanning electron micrograph of the inside of alveoli. So you can see the nice thin membrane, respiratory membrane right there. And that's where gas exchange takes place. So in this lecture, as we study gas exchange, we'll be looking at how oxygen is obtained from inspired air and enters the blood and then travels in the blood all the way to the peripheral tissues and then is released to the tissues. We'll also be looking at how carbon dioxide leaves the tissues, enters the blood, and then is released into the alveolar spaces for us to exhale. So both oxygen and carbon dioxide gas exchange. So you should know that there's 2 places where gas exchange takes place. The first is in the lungs across the respiratory membranes. And that respiratory membrane we've defined prior to this. It includes the alveolar wall, so simple squamous epithelium, and then a basement membrane with some protein fibers. And then the next layer of simple squamous epithelium is part of the capillary wall. So this will be gas exchange from air into blood or blood into air. The second location where gas exchange takes place is between the blood and the interstitial fluid out in the peripheral tissues, or you could call them the systemic tissues. And so at that location, you're going to have oxygen leaving the blood and going to the interstitial fluid, but you'll have carbon dioxide going the other way because the cells will make CO2 and transport that CO2 across their membrane into the interstitial fluid. From there, the CO2 will enter the bloodstream and travel to the lungs. So we'll talk a lot about how gases diffuse, how they move, how they're transported across cell membranes. And just like everything else we've studied, the gases will move from a region of high concentration to a region of low concentration, but we don't use the term concentration. We use the term partial pressure or partial pressure of a gas. So there'll be a partial pressure of oxygen and a partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Another thing that will be helpful to discuss gas exchange is to be familiar with these terms: gas loading and gas unloading. This refers to what's happening in the blood. So blood is the reference point. When gas moves into the blood, we call that gas loading. When gas moves out of the blood, we call that gas unloading. So in the lungs, there's oxygen gas loading and carbon dioxide gas unloading. Now there's various things that contribute to how efficient gas exchange occurs or how much gas exchange occurs. The largest factor, the most important, will be this gradient of pressure. There are other things though, and that is one factor is solubility of the gas in the medium that it exists in, and then in the medium it's going to. So gas is pretty soluble in air because air is a gas. But then for gas to diffuse into the blood, it's going to be entering a liquid environment. And the opposite happens with carbon dioxide. It has a certain solubility in blood and a different solubility, of course, in air. Now, the solubility of these gases, how well they're dissolved in a liquid like blood or the interstitial fluid or even the alveolar fluid in the lung, will depend on the temperature of the fluid and the temperature of the air. And in general, a higher temperature would increase solubility. Two other factors that contribute to how efficient gas exchange is relate to the respiratory membrane. How thick is it? So normally the thickness of the respiratory membrane is constant, but if you have mucus plugging up the respiratory membrane, obviously, or some other disease like cystic fibrosis, obviously it's harder for the gas to move across that membrane. Another factor relates to the surface area available for gas exchange. What this means is how much respiratory membrane is functional in the lung. And of course, with disease, you have destruction of alveoli, and so the surface area would decrease. And we'll talk more about that in the disorders lecture. The final factor that contributes to the efficiency of gas exchange has to do with how well matched ventilation of an alveolus is with the degree of perfusion of that alveolus. Now those words probably don't mean much to you yet, and I will explain to them in more detail, but for now, just think about how much air enters an alveolus will dictate how much blood it receives. And also how much blood goes to an alveolus will dictate how inflated it can become. It's really a cool thing. It's called the coupling of ventilation and perfusion in the lung. But for now, we're going to focus on the pressure gradient and how that causes gas exchange in the lung and in the systemic tissues. To do that, let's look at some factors related to the air that we breathe in. So when we inspire atmospheric air, it changes somewhat, okay, and we'll talk about that later. But once it gets into the lung, there are several gases from the atmosphere that enter our lung. First of all, nitrogen gas, then oxygen gas, and even water vapor, which is a gas, and carbon dioxide. So all of these gases are entering the lung. And when we start talking about concentration, we need to understand that gas mixture, like what we breathe in, has a certain pressure, like atmospheric pressure, for example. But each individual gas has its own pressure that it contributes to that total pressure. The individual gas pressure is called a partial pressure. So for example, here we inspire 4 different gases. Each contributes to the atmospheric pressure of 760 right here. And notice that the partial pressures are listed, and if you add all of those up, they will equal 760 millimeters of mercury. So we breathe in a lot of nitrogen. Nitrogen pressure contributes 78.6% of the atmospheric pressure. Oxygen is second with 159 millimeters of mercury, or 21% roughly. And then there's a little bit of water vapor and much less of CO2. But the concept that I'm trying to get across is that each gas exhibits its own pressure, its own partial pressure within a gas mixture. This is known as Dalton's gas law. So the total pressure of a gas, So in this left vial here, we've got a total pressure of 15 millimeters of mercury. This total pressure of the gas mixture is equal to the sum of the individual gases' partial pressures. So gas A, if it's the green gas, contributes 10 millimeters of mercury. Gas B, the orange one, contributes 5 millimeters of mercury. Or you can report it in percentages too, 2/3 and 1/3, roughly. So that's our first concept, the concept of partial pressures. Now we're going to look at the difference between atmospheric pressure, what we breathe in, and the contents of the air in the alveoli. So let's look at inspired air first, because we just looked at that before. We know the total pressure is 760, and in the alveolus that stays the same. What changes are the partial pressures. Notice first that compared to the air we breathe in, we have less oxygen once it reaches our alveolus. And then also notice that compared to the air we breathe in, the water vapor increases drastically, more than 10 times. And then third, the carbon dioxide that we breathe in is very low, which makes sense. But the air in our lungs, even after we inspire, is higher. Now, I can explain the first two relatively easily, and the third one will make sense once we talk about the first one, I think. So, why does the PO2, the partial pressure of oxygen, decrease in alveolar air? It's because the fresh air that we breathe in mixes with the residual air that's left in the lungs. Remember, we always have this residual volume. In addition, oxygen is quickly taken out of the alveolus and diffuses into the bloodstream. So it's very hard to pinpoint a really high oxygen level of alveolar air. Now, the second thing has to do with water. Why does the amount of water essentially increase in the alveolus compared to what we inhale from the atmosphere? Well, the partial pressure of water vapor is higher in the alveoli due to humidification by the fluid secreted by those type 2 cells in the alveoli. In addition, the air that's sitting in the lungs, residual or being exhaled in the process of being exhaled, has been humidified by the mucous membranes in all the airways, in all the conductive passageways. So if we think about the fact that CO2 travels to the alveolus via the blood, you can imagine that it's going to be higher in the alveolus than it would be in the air we inspire, but it will quickly diffuse out when we exhale, or I mean leave the lung when we exhale, not diffusion. Okay, our third concept deals with how gases diffuse, and they diffuse based on a pressure gradient. So oxygen is going to move according to its pressure gradient, independent from the way that carbon dioxide diffuses, from the direction. So a partial pressure gradient will determine the direction that a gas diffuses. And the direction that oxygen moves is independent from the direction that carbon dioxide moves. It all depends on the gradient. And so if we have high PO2 outside of whatever this circle space is, and low PO2 inside, you know that oxygen will diffuse into this circle. And if we have low CO2 on the inside and high CO2 on the outside, CO2 will go in the same direction. It's going to go into the circle. But of course, more often than not, they have opposite concentration gradients. So usually we'll see high in a cell, high, and low outside of a cell. So the idea is that oxygen moves independent from carbon dioxide. And these gases will continue to diffuse across the respiratory membrane or across the cell membrane or into the blood until equilibrium is reached. And what equilibrium means is that there will be the same partial pressures on both sides. And once that has been achieved, I'll just make up a number here. Let's say a partial pressure of oxygen equaling 10. Once equilibrium has been reached, then no more diffusion will take place. And so we're interested in looking at what the gradient is across the respiratory membrane in the lung and what the gradient is across the capillary wall in the systemic tissues. Okay, we're going to start with the lung, and now we're going to look at the details of how oxygen is loaded in the lung and how CO2 is unloaded. Remember, that refers to blood, loading and unloading. So we're in the lung. So this is the respiratory membrane consisting of the capillary wall, the basement membrane, and the alveolar wall. And in the lung, the partial pressure of oxygen is 104. That is higher than the pulmonary, capillary, arterial end. The partial O2 in the blood is only 40. So when you're in the lung, oxygen is going to move into the blood. Now let's look at CO2 instead. The partial pressure of CO2 is higher in the blood. It's at 46. Than it is in the alveolus, where it's 40. So CO2 will move into the alveolus or unload from the blood. What's really interesting about this is that in the lung, we're primarily usually interested in oxygen loading of the blood, but it is equally important for us to get that carbon dioxide out. But if we just focus on oxygen loading for a minute, equilibrium between 104 and 40 is reached so quickly. We are able to diffuse oxygen into our blood so rapidly that equilibrium is achieved in 0.25 seconds of a second. That's really fast. I don't have any data for how fast it happens in the systemic tissues for carbon dioxide. I wish I did, but I don't. Okay, so this is gas loading and unloading in the systemic tissues, again based on pressure gradients. And so now we're in the systemic tissues where we have a capillary bed, an interstitial fluid, and of course the cells that have made carbon dioxide. So first, of course, there are studies of how CO2 crosses the cell membrane in all of these cases, but we're looking at more of a bigger picture than that, believe it or not. And so let's look at oxygen first. The PO2 in the blood as a whole, it's either in the red blood cell or in the plasma, a little bit of both, is 95. But the PO2 in the interstitial fluid is low, 40, because those cells have used up the oxygen. They use it quite rapidly to make ATP. So in this situation, oxygen is going to leave the blood or be unloaded and enter the interstitial fluid and eventually the cells. The opposite, of course, is true for carbon dioxide. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the arterial blood supply is 40, and in the interstitial tissues, it's 46. So you can see that there is a pressure gradient. It's not very steep, but there's a pressure gradient so that CO2 will leave the systemic cells, interstitial fluid, and then load into the blood. So let's look at how oxygen levels change from the alveoli all the way to the systemic tissues and then eventually back to the lungs. Okay, let's just look at CO2, or it's not CO2, I'm sorry, I keep doing that. Oxygen levels to explain why diffusion happens at these two locations in the opposite directions. So oxygen, the pressure gradient for oxygen in the lungs makes it load into the blood, but the pressure gradient of oxygen down in the tissues makes oxygen unload, right? Or blood unload oxygen. So let's look at how this works. We're going to start up here at the atmosphere. And we're just looking at what's in bold here. The partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere is 159. We inhale it, and then in the alveolus it's a little bit lower. Part of that is because oxygen is absorbed into the bloodstream really quickly. Part of it is because oxygen is mixing with residual gases that exist in the lung. So it's already decreased. So from the atmosphere to the alveolus. Now we can start talking about diffusion. So we've got in the alveolar sacs, or in the alveoli individually, we've got 104. And the pulmonary artery comes from the heart, pretty oxygen deprived. There is a partial pressure of oxygen of only 40 millimeters of mercury coming into the lung. And so that right away explains diffusion. Oxygen is going to go from the alveoli into the pulmonary artery. And now that oxygen-richer blood will be go through the capillaries, and enter the pulmonary vein, and it gets up to, because of the diffusion in the lung, the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood gets up to 100 millimeters of mercury. So that's what's in the pulmonary vein, and that goes into the heart, out the aorta, traveling through various arteries, and out in the systemic arteries there's an average partial pressure of oxygen still at 100, which I think is a little bit of an oversimplification, but that's okay, fine. But in the interstitial fluids, out here between the cells, it's only 40. So that means that oxygen is going to leave the blood to supply the tissues. And what's left is really 40. So what comes back to the heart is 40. And then, of course, this blood that has a 40 millimeters of mercury of oxygen will be again in the pulmonary artery, go back to the lungs where there's a high partial pressure of oxygen, travel to the capillary beds where there is a low partial pressure of oxygen. So I hope that helps. If you start at atmosphere and work your way around, it explains why oxygen moves from the alveolus into the pulmonary artery, and why oxygen moves from the systemic arteries into the interstitial fluid of the tissues. Now let's do the same thing with partial pressures of carbon dioxide. This time I think it makes the most sense to start down at the systemic vessels, the systemic arteries. So the partial pressure of carbon dioxide that has come from the aorta, which is, carrying blood that just came back from the lungs. So CO2 should be relatively low, and it is. It's at 40. But the systemic tissues have been busy producing CO2. And so the CO2 is higher than 45. It's about 45. That's fine. When we get to the veins, so that explains why, sorry, I should explain that. That explains why carbon dioxide moves from the interstitial fluids into the blood from 45 to 40, down a pressure gradient. And now this blood that's returning to the heart has a partial pressure of carbon dioxide of about 45 millimeters of mercury. Okay, and it's going to go into the ventricle and then out the pulmonary artery, where it has picked up a little bit more CO2 by this time, but still 45, 46. And it enters the lung. And alveolar gas has a partial pressure of carbon dioxide, which is 40. And therefore, 46 is greater than 40. And so carbon dioxide leaves the pulmonary artery and goes into the alveolus so that we can exhale it. I hope that was helpful for you. So in the lung, I'm just going to review a little bit. In the lung, we have the loading of oxygen because there's a difference, a partial pressure gradient of oxygen that favors oxygen entering the blood from 104 to 40. And likewise in the lung, if I look at the lung for CO2, this favors the gas moving out of the blood, unloading CO2 into the alveolus because there's a pressure gradient from blood to the alveolus, high to low. If we look at the systemic tissues instead, we see that blood unloads oxygen because there's a pressure gradient between the blood and the systemic arteries and the fluid in the systemic tissues. So the pressure gradient is 100 versus 40, so that makes oxygen leave. We'll do the same thing for carbon dioxide at the systemic tissues. You see that at the systemic tissues, the interstitial fluids have a higher CO2 than the blood contains, at least in the arterial end, which is 40. So that makes the carbon dioxide enter the bloodstream, or carbon dioxide is loaded in the systemic tissues. Okay, the last factor that contributes to the degree of gas exchange that can happen in a particular area of the lung is due to a mechanism called ventilation perfusion coupling. And what this is a mechanism that matches the degree that an alveolus is ventilated, getting air, with the degree that it's perfused, how much blood it receives. So how much is an alveolus expanded is matched to how much blood flow it receives. And of course, I have these definitions written below. Ventilation refers to the amount of gas that reaches the alveolus, and you can think of expanding the alveolus. I think it helps visually. And then perfusion refers to how much blood flow goes to that same alveolus. And they affect each other. So I want to explain this diagram that I created down here because it's not intuitive. It just looks like a bunch of shapes. This is supposed to be the trachea coming down in purple, and it splits into two primary bronchi. And the blue thing is an alveolar sac. Sometimes we just simplify it and say it's an alveolus, but it's really a group of alveoli receiving air from a respiratory bronchiole. Okay, so then we have beneath the alveolar sac the blood vessels that supply blood to that alveolus or that alveolar sac. And it has a certain diameter here. So what you're going to be paying attention to as I talk are the sizes of the alveolar sac, the blue circle, the blood vessel, the red cylinder, and then eventually also this bronchus diameter. And what we're going to see is that ventilation affects perfusion, and the opposite is true. Perfusion, the amount of perfusion, affects the amount that an alveolus is ventilated. It is the coolest mechanism. So we're going to take case one. We're going to say we start normal. Okay, we're in a lung where both of these blue alveoli are receiving adequate ventilation, pretty equal ventilation, and so the amount of perfusion is also equal. Okay, so what that means is that we have a balanced situation. In this case one, we're going to change that. In case one, we're going to change it so that there's low ventilation in one of these alveolar sacs. So first, let's assume that there's an obstruction that impairs the ventilation. That's what the problem is, just as an example. So there's an obstruction right there. It's kind of hazy. It's hard to see. So when that ventilation is obstructed, this alveolus is not going to expand, or the alveolar sac will not expand. It's not going to receive very much air, and so that O2 level will be low. The oxygen level will be low. And at first, perfusion is the same. You don't see any difference between a well-ventilated alveolus and one that's not expanded very well. But then something remarkable happens. I think it's remarkable. And that is that due to this low, I'm on the third point here, due to this lower ventilation and the low oxygen partial pressure, you're going to have less oxygen going into the blood because at that location. Still normal over here. It's just fine. But at this particular location in the lung, you'll have less oxygen diffusion into the blood. Now this is the remarkable part. With low O2, so we have low O2 in the blood, it causes this pulmonary arteriole to constrict. So now less blood is flowing to the poorly ventilated alveolar sac. And more blood will eventually go to the alveolar sac that's well ventilated. So this is something that's unusual because when we talked about levels of blood oxygen levels in blood before, we said that low O2 causes vessels to dilate, right? That's in the systemic tissues though. It's different in the pulmonary vessels. I'm sorry, it's in vessels that go to the systemic tissues where you get dilation. But when you're in the lung, the pulmonary vessels respond the opposite. And so when there's low oxygen in the blood, these vessels will tend to constrict. Now there's something else that happens, which is pretty cool. We're still in the same case. We've got low ventilation in one area of the lung, but what happens is that then all the air is going to this other alveolus. I just didn't mention it before. So now this alveolus or alveolar sac is hyperventilated in a different region of the lung. And that means you have higher oxygen in this region of the lung. And so more oxygen will diffuse into the blood. And therefore the high oxygen level in the blood causes vasodilation of the vessel supplying that particular alveolus. Now what we have are ventilation, or is ventilation perfusion balance. We have complete balance. Our alveoli that's not receiving much air doesn't receive much blood, and the alveolus that's receiving a lot of air receives a lot of blood. And it's all due to oxygen blood levels. Okay. And so I have this summary for you. How does alveolar ventilation cause changes in alveolar perfusion? It's due to blood PO2, or partial pressure of oxygen, in pulmonary arterioles. So when you have low ventilation, you have low alveolar PO2, but then of course in the blood you have low PO2, and that's going to cause the pulmonary arteriole to constrict. The opposite is true when you have high ventilation. You have high alveolar PO2 and high blood PO2 because all that oxygen diffuses into the blood, and therefore all the vessels that supply that arteriole dilate. It's pretty nifty. Okay, in addition, CO2 plays a role in this ventilation perfusion coupling business. But CO2 does not control blood vessel diameter. CO2 levels control bronchiole diameters. So I just want to go back 1 second and see here that it was alveolar oxygen, which translated to blood oxygen levels, that caused the change in diameter, whatever it was. Okay, so now what we're going to have is alveolar CO2 can directly affect the airways going to that alveolus. So if we have, and it's usually the reason we have changes in alveolar CO2 is due to the fact that perfusion has changed. So if we have increased perfusion to one alveolus, that alveolus is going to experience or get more carbon dioxide because more carbon dioxide will diffuse into the alveolar space. That will affect the diameter of the bronchi or the bronchioles, and you'll get bronchodilation. The smooth muscle will relax, and so you may notice that this particular bronchus is dilated compared to what it was before. Okay, and then of course the opposite is true as well. When you have I'll go here. When you have low perfusion here, sorry, I'm losing my thing. When you have low perfusion, maybe there's some sort of lung disease that's causing this pulmonary arteriole to go feed a cancer cell instead of the alveolus, whatever, you have less perfusion in this area of the lung, you'll have lower CO2 in this alveolus. If you have less CO2, that causes bronchoconstriction because you don't have to get that CO2 out. That's why. So ventilation perfusion coupling is really cool. So this is a similar summary of how alveolar perfusion can change alveolar ventilation. And it says here that in blue, adequate blood supply to an alveolus causes the bronchiole supplying that alveolus to dilate. But when there's poor blood supply to an alveolus, it causes that bronchiole to constrict. So it's the exact opposite of, or I guess it helps, I guess, kind of accommodate what happened before when we looked at oxygen. And that is that when blood has low O2, pulmonary arteries constrict. And when blood has a high O2, those pulmonary arteries dilate. So that's the end of the first lecture dealing with gas exchange and gas transport. Thank you very much.